Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. I've been asked by one of my loyal viewers to speak a little bit about Irish travellers. Who are they? What are their origins? Well, there is a common misconception that they are gypsies. They are sometimes called Irish gypsies, but that's a misnomer. They traditionally had a similar itinerant lifestyle to gypsies. So the Irish travellers are 0.5% of the population of Ireland. They're mostly found in the Republic of Ireland, a few in Northern Ireland. They've gone to Great Britain and occasionally further afield. They quite often have the surnames Ward and McDonough. Now, not everybody with the surname Ward and McDonough is of traveller extraction, and obviously some travellers have other surnames. So we're not talking about a huge community. Perhaps 40,000 people in Ireland are travellers. And obviously the name is descriptive because they did move from place to place. Now, they used to be known by other names, but these are generally regarded as derogatory now, and travellers sometimes call themselves these names, but they don't want other people to call them by those names. I'll come on to those in a bit. So I'll talk about gypsies later and how they're distinct. So the travellers have a very strong sense of family values. That's one of the things that's really laudable about their culture. And they usually get married at the youngest legal age. In the Republic of Ireland, that's 18, and certainly for girls. And the legal age is 18 for both genders, but girls tend to get married when they reach 18. And they'll have these semi-arranged marriages. The parents will say, well, you can start walking out with this boy with a view to forming a relationship with him and get married pretty soon. So they get married and they have several children usually. So marriage is very much considered to be for life. So divorce is pretty unusual. Cohabiting when they're not married is considered unacceptable. Children almost never born outside of wedlock. And adultery is just considered beyond the pale. Homosexuality is generally frowned on. So they're a bit old-fashioned, you could say. Do they have a king? This is often a misconception there is. Well, because they've got such a big sense of family values, such a profound sense of family values, they often have enormous weddings. They tend to have large families anyway, so inviting second cousins and even third cousins, and likewise funerals are very well attended. And if there's a prominent traveller has passed away, a journalist will often ask someone, is so-and-so the king of the travellers? And some of the travellers find it amusing to say, yes, he's our king. But they were said to have Donnybrooks, always be fist fighting. Now, that definitely goes on, but we mustn't stereotype them and say, oh, they're violent. There was a wedding in Fermanagh a couple of years ago where somebody was shot dead at the wedding. So in their rites of passage, they certainly tend to be extravagant. On the whole, they do not have a high income or a long life expectancy, and alcohol is very much part of their culture, part of Irish culture generally, but I think travellers particularly so. I hope that's not negative stereotyping. I'm not sure if there's objective data to back that up. I'm not suggesting most travellers are alcoholics. Obviously, alcoholism exists in all ethnic communities, but it's more prevalent in some than others. So how did the travellers come to be? Well, they are indigenous Irish people, as they would be very distantly related to me. But they were displaced in the 1600s when O'Neill's rebellion in Ulster come to an end. There was the flight of the Earls in 1607. Much of the Gaelic aristocracy left the country, and a lot of English, Welsh, Scots, even Manx immigrants came in, settled particularly in Ulster. That's partly why they were displaced. They're displaced for other reasons as well. They started wandering around the country and never stopped. There is another thing is we were semi-nomadic until about then, because Ireland's not very suitable for the culture of the soil. Cereal crops don't grow that well, and so we were often pastoralists following our herds of cattle, often in a circuit, and we were divided into different clans, each with their own chieftain, often fighting over pasture. So perhaps it's not really they who changed, it's the rest of us changed to some extent, and the rest of us adopted a more sedentary lifestyle. It might be a bit of both that the rest of us changed, and maybe they changed a bit as well, becoming even more itinerant than before. And remember, the early 17th century is when the potato was brought back from the American continent, and that transformed Irish agriculture, and it caused our population to increase eightfold in about 200 years, because this very hardy crop will grow on thin, stony soil where the coast is wind-lashed, where there's very heavy rain, there's very little rain, if it's very cold, if it's very hot, whether you have heavy rainfall or not at sea level in the mountains. This selfie thing is terrible. This is meant to be holding it. Anyway, so they had a role in society. And by the way, that they have their own version, their own dialect, really. It's version of Irish. Shelt is the official name, often called cant. And travellers themselves have called it cant to me. But the thing is, cant can mean nonsense, as is an English word to say something is drivel. So I don't think that's why it's called cant. But anyway, it's almost impenetrable for any other speaker of Irish. It's a blend of Irish, English, and then some words which are sui generis. So until the late 19th century, they had a role in society. They were travelling around, and they were dealing in cattle and horses. They were bone setters, fortune tellers, performing in circuses and things like that. They were trading in second-hand clothes or making things out of tin. Now, they were sometimes called tinkers. I don't mean to be rude, but people did sometimes say that, and that was a matter-of-fact word in the old days. In the late 20th century, that came to be seen as an insult. So I'm only saying that just to inform you. Or people then derisively called them knackers in more recent time, as in they dealing in old bad horses, saying that one's for the knacker's yard, as in go kill that horse and turn its bones into glue. I'm knackered to mean I'm very tired. It's common Irish slang. So people often be rude about them calling them these words. Anyway, remember, until the late 19th century, most people in most countries, and even into the 20th century in many cases, were farmers, because we didn't have such good technology, we hadn't made so many scientific advances, and so we were living outside close to animals. We didn't have indoor plumbing, we didn't wash ourselves or our clothes very frequently. We were very unhygienic. Frankly, we stank, and we had no idea about oral hygiene. We didn't have much soap, things like that. Clothes were handmade, hand-washed. A lot of children were barefoot. But the late 19th century, certainly in the more developed countries, that began to change. We got indoor plumbing. We all began to understand the importance of hygiene, washing ourselves and our clothes. We were no longer working with animals most of the time or doing physical jobs where we had to get our hands dirty. So but there started to be a difference between the settled working class and travellers. So travellers living in caravans often didn't have such access to running water to wash themselves or their clothes. They tend to have very low incomes. It's more difficult for them to have enough clothes and things like that. So again, not wishing to be impolite, but they found it more difficult to be hygienic than most people. And they no longer had such a role in society. We had railways. We didn't need horses so much. We didn't even need cattle so much, or to pull ploughs and things like that. We were moving on to sheep. They tended not to deal sheep so much. And we had other forms of entertainment as more people were literate, going to the theatre. Eventually we had radio in the 20th century, and we weren't buying second-hand clothes so much. We didn't need handmade goods out of tin. We were buying manufactured things. And often cities were filthy in the old days with middens and open sewers, and that began to change. Legislation was passed saying that triperies, sausage factories, charnel houses had to move outside the city limits for purposes of public hygiene, and sanitation improved. So they no longer had such a role in society. They began to be noticeable and distinguishable from the settled proletariat. And that's when hostility towards travellers came about. And there was a lot of prejudice against them. Remember the Forced Education Act, 1870, every child getting to go to school. Travellers often not getting to go to school just because they were moving around so much. If they were, they'd often face a great deal of hostility, be bullied. Sometimes the teachers would even lead the bullying, insulting them for not having clothes and shoes and things like that. So, and if they were entitled to care for their children, if they were disabled, sometimes they weren't even allowed into the institution where that was happening. In the late 20th century, some politicians in Ireland were making anti-traveller remarks, and they say, no, that's unacceptable, speaking up for them to be integrated. Now, some travellers now lead a settled lifestyle, but some still wish to be regarded as being travellers. And there have been lots of controversies, halting sites. Can they just camp anywhere? Well, a lot of property is privately owned. People don't want them camping in public parks or in playing fields and so on. Halting sites have to be provided for them so they can have their caravans. No longer horse-drawn caravans, such as I saw in my childhood, but now cars as pulling caravans or motorhomes, things like that. So prejudice persists, but it's reduced. They want themselves classified as an ethnic minority. Well, there's no doubt that they are autochthonous Irish people, but they just separated off the mainstream Irish community in the 17th century, and there's been a little bit of intermarriage. But there are certainly some bigotry against them. Let's not overstate it. So far as I know, no travellers have been killed for their ethnicity. They often work in construction. Some of them lived in Great Britain for generations and still have an Irish accent. Now, as for Gypsies originate in Gujarat, that state in India, where Gandhi was born, and about 1,000 years ago they went west through Iran, through the Middle East, some were in Turkey, some were still in Turkey actually, and through Egypt, and then various through Europe. The largest Gypsy communities are in Romania and Slovakia. Sometimes they're called Rom or Romani, or even Sinti people. But what else about them? So they reached England in the 16th century, and under Elizabeth I, the Egyptians Act was passed. They'd passed through Egypt. People called them Egyptians, and that was corrupted into Gypsy. So the Egyptians Act was about the Gypsies, and people would sometimes insultingly call them Gyppo. It's an insult. And there's another word as a verb, a slang verb, which is saying to be gypped, as in to be tricked. So again, it's related to this racist concept that they're all dishonest. So Romani people are different, but they've been in England for over 400 years, and they're Anglo-Romani, and I don't think many of them can speak the Romani language anymore. But it is distantly related to Gujarati. They passed through all those countries, and obviously there have been accretions from other languages. There's a Gypsy flag. There was some Gypsy conference in London about 1975. So for centuries there was a lot of anti-Gypsy prejudice, and in Germany people called them travelling thieves and things like that, and they were told they had to quit their lifestyle or be hanged, and there was similar legislation in England, which I mentioned, so they were naughty, idle and godless lifestyle. So they did face severe discrimination. So they're a distinctive community. Obviously, they can be recognised by their darker complexion, usually, particularly in Romania and Slovakia. I would think if I didn't know this person was Slovak or Romanian, I might think this person was Indian. In a sense, they are. And they were captured by the Tatars in what's now called the Ukraine, and they were held in slavery. They're often sold to Romanian aristocrats and monasteries, and there were slaves in Romania until 1859. Their experience in Romania is not unlike that of African Americans in the United States. And in the Holocaust, they were murdered in huge numbers. It's known as the Pojamoros by them, as in the gobbling up. So the Romanian fascist dictator at the time, Ion Antonescu, he enthusiastically participated in that. And what else about him? I was very disturbed when I was in Romania to see Romanian graffiti saying Antonescu Ero Național, Antonescu national hero, despite what he'd done. And I heard a lot of anti-Gypsy or anti-Ziganist, to be more accurate, prejudice when I was in Romania. Having said that, I didn't know of any physical attacks on Gypsies at all. And I had Gypsy pupils, and people seemed to dislike the Gypsies they didn't know, not the ones that they did. Sometimes they were pop stars, some of them were wealthy. But that was that. Some of them were socially marginal, lived their traditional lifestyle, wearing the traditional clothes. So the Irish travellers and the Gypsies are distinct. However, there has been some intermarriage between Irish travellers and Anglo-Romani people. And that's why, obviously, the complexion has changed. And some Gypsies have been in the United Kingdom for, as I say, well over 400 years, are quite anglicised or Caledonicized, Cumbricized, whatever, Hibernicized even, and not of fully Gypsy stock and don't necessarily live the Gypsy lifestyle. Some of them prefer to be called Roma, Romani, Sinti. All these words, they're interchangeable with Gypsy. I say anti-Ziganist because the word is Zigeuner in German, or Zigan, Romanian, Zigan in French, Zigano in Italian. They're all related like that. That is that. I've even seen Gypsies wearing those distinctive Gypsy skirts and so on in Argentina, and some of them moved to the United States. So those are the origins of Irish travellers and indeed Gypsies, two distinct but somewhat similar groups.